Hi, welcome to Tech Ranch, a place where we learn and earn technical skills in the most efficient way. Let's make coding fun. Servlet API Tutorial Chapter 2 Servlet API and its life cycle method. So in this video, we are going to learn in detail about Servlet API and its life cycle method and a complete process in detail. So far, in the chapter 1, we learned about Servlet Architecture, where we have learned about web client and web server and the complete process, how a servlet process the HTTP request and get the response to the client. And according to this architecture, we have seen the browser starts from the www.client name, goes to the server, and from inside the server, with the help of the HTTP request, it goes inside the web component and inside the servlet container where the Servlet API exists, and then process the complete business logic. And if in case it required to contact the database, it goes to the database with the help of JDBC and process the input and get the output and provide the response back to the client with the help of HTTP response. So this was a complete process. We have learned in detail about Servlet architecture. Now, according to this architecture, you can understand the Servlet API exists within the server, web server, within the web server, inside the Servlet container. So this is where the Servlet API exists. Let's learn about Servlet API in detail. The Servlet API is divided into 3 layers. The top layer consists of interfaces and abstract base classes that are not specific to any particular communication protocol. You can see the generic servlet that is available to all other FTP or HTTP, SMTP kind of protocols. You can use it. The second level consists of abstract classes and sub-interfaces that extend the generic functionality for specific protocols. And the last and the third layer consist of classes that implement the full capability of the layer above. So this is how it is different from one another, and it is how it is structured in a layered form. But if you see, the most commonly used HTTP request servlet are used interfaces are mentioned in this structure. The servlet request interface, the servlet interface, and servlet response with respect to your requirement. You just need to implement these interfaces and override these methods and use and implement the servlet. Just in case if you want to have a HTTP request, you just need to implement HTTP servlet request and implement and overnight these methods: get header names, get int header, get date header. Similarly, if you have a generic servlet, you just need to override it, and HTTP servlet for the generic purpose, where we have the service method, do get method, do post method, trace, do options, destroy, do head, and so many like this. These are the most commonly used. Then we have servlet response interface, which has HTTP servlet response interface, where you can override set header name method, set int header, get date header. These kind of most commonly used methods we generally use while implementation of servlet. Let's learn a few important facts about Servlet API. Servlet API exists with the callback methods for initialization and request processing. These methods by which the servlet can get configuration and environment information. Access to protocol specific resources. So what does this mean? It depends what type of protocol you are using for this particular request and response. Sometimes they have SMTP kind of request or FTP type of request. So that is specific to this API. as we have interfaces and abstract classes, so there are some callback methods that you can use to initialize and override it. And this kind of methods needs a complete configuration and environmental information that you will understand when we will come up with the demonstration. Next, we have request response API. That means these request and response, getting it from the client or browser, basically have some information. So communication is very important in this case from web server to web client and vice versa, because retrieving form data, pass data from one component to another, retrieve security information, generate output, all these things are very important to be maintained accurate and efficiently. This is why servlet is important. Request object. When the client start a thread to create a request, and this object has to be implemented in the method and called in a method so that we can implement the servlet. That means request object is nothing but a object extended from the class HTTP servlet request, and this request object you can use and call to implement the methods and call those methods which is already available in the Servlet API, and use and make this process extended. For example, you are requesting for a logged in servlet and you create ID and password. So from browser, the client is requesting for login and giving you information. So this information has to be passed on to the servlet. So when it is request object is created from the client, the servlet will implement those methods and call back those methods and get the information from the request and pass it to the servlet. So this process has to be happened with the help of request object. Now, next step, response object. Just like request object, response object will process from server to the client. We have this HTTP servlet response interface where we implement that servlet class to that interface and override those methods and call and communicate to the client. Similarly, there are some more, for example, session management, we have filters, we have tag handling, exception handling. Similarly, we have request dispatcher interface, which is another very interesting part of Servlet, where what we can do, we can forward the control and passing the data. That we can do it, discuss it in detail later in next few chapters. But for now, this is one of the important interface. So I just want to communicate with you what it has when it comes to the forward include kind of process. Like you are forwarding a control from one servlet to another servlet or another HTML or any other form of thread. What you can do, you just create the implement the request dispatcher interface and override forward method or include method and pass the control of the server from the client using forward method, or include the control of passing the data simply from server to client and vice versa. So this is all about the Servlet API in details. Let's learn about Servlet lifecycle method. As you can see, we have seen in the Servlet architecture, there is a web component. Inside there, we have Servlet container, and that's where the servlet exists. Now, when we start a client request, it starts from the init method, which is defined in the Servlet API, where we create an instance of request. and request can be if any protocol. Suppose since it is a web application development profile, so you can have the HTTP request. After creating an instance of HTTP request, the thread passes it to the service method, which is actually the main method where we write down the complete logic. What do you want to do in the server? So HTTP service method has few methods, which is like an override method. All you have to just override and come up with some kind of functionality, where inside you can validate any form of data, where you collect and updates application data model, or you can pass this data to another component and implement the do-get method. Now, what is the difference between do post and do get and do trace? When it is a form of get data, you have to give the do get method, override the do get method. And if it is a post type from the init method, it will be do post type of method. And in the end, you have to destroy the instance of request to deallocate the memory and release the instance to help and make it efficient process. This helps to, like a thread handling. It's kind of a thread handling, helping you to making an efficient process. Let's learn it in detail about server lifecycle, how it processes. So you see, we have a web server. So let's learn about servlet lifecycle. If you see here, we start from the web client. The client will create an HTTP request and send to servlet container. This is your web component, and inside the web component we have any kind of container like servlet container, web container, your EJB containers, whatever kind of application you have, FTP container. That's where it goes, and it has a complete components, modules, web modules you can say. And inside the web modules they have a different kind of containers, which is the place where the servlet or any kind of container exists, or APIs are exist. So servlet container where the servlet APIs exist, how it processes the request now. So number one, we have the HTTP request. Number two, it will process in the thread, multi-threading. So thread A initiate the request in a HTTP request object, and it will create an instance by using init method. So service method process the business logic by thread B. Now next step, the thread B will implement your service method, and once the service method is implemented, the service method return the HTTP response to the servlet container and provide the response to the client. And number 5, the thread C, that will remove the instance of this request and response completely. So this will help to deallocate the memory location created by the instance. So this is all about the servlet lifecycle methods in detail. Now let's see a small demonstration of FirstServlet application. So all we have to have few things, the environment set up in your system before going to the execution, but I have already set it up, and we have the next chapter for the software application installation guide. So for now I'm just going to show you how the servlet execute and why it is important. So all you have to have first, create the dynamic web application. I have created test web app. It has servlet, FirstServlet, which is written in Java, so we have it a .java file. Creating HTML, index HTML, it's one of the scripting language where we start the execution. and deployment descriptor, which is very important, a kind of a property of the servlet. It's or any kind of web application. This is called Web.xml. How this directory structure goes here, you have a test web app folder. Inside that you have to have a classes folder inside the web INF, and inside that you will describe your pre-compiled class file. You will have your index.html and the web.xml inside the web INF when you go through the directory structure. And how it processes. So test web app is a web application folder. So suppose the client try to reach the test web application servlet, and it's asked for any information from the servlet, or servlet is asking for it, something like a login. And web.xml has some starting thread information for the servlet. So that starts from web.xml. It exists some information that will go to the index.html, and then index.html, it will go to the first servlet, the main servlet, and process the request. Now I'll show you in a code. If you see, we have FirstServlet.java Servlet. This is my application, Servlet application, and this is my source app as a package and FirstServlet.java file. So that's where my servlet is written. I have mentioned here, extend the HTTP servlet, which has the doPost method. HTTP servlet is a class, so we extend that class. Inside this class, we have doPost method, which we can override it. Here I have overridden, and I'm trying to getting the response from the index.html file, and calling my first servlet parameter, and that first parameter, whatever the user entered, the login ID will be presented here that you have logged in successfully. That's all I'm doing it here. Next, you see the index.html file which exists here. In this .html file, I am just making a form where I'm calling the name, ID and object of the HTML, object of a request, to link it to the servlet, communicate to the servlet. It's a type of a post because I made it in a doPost method, overrided the doPost method. Action, this will go to the servlet. App is a package, and first servlet, my servlet name. This is the syntax it has to be passed. Next, name, I'm just getting the value, the first servlet, the name value, the first servlet, and that's it. Next, most important is your Web.xml, the deployment descriptor. It's one of the kind of the properties of web application or servlet application, where we have the display name is your nothing. You can have it anything which will just display on the IP address or your address of your server. Servlet name, your first servlet, and the compiled class path. We need to give the compiled class path here. Servlet mapping, you need to give a keyword of servlet and pass again the same class path, which will help to communicate and give the link from servlet to back to the servlet when it is communicating from HTML to servlet. And welcome file list is your first file from where the request will pass or start while working in this servlet. So this is what the application looks like for the servlet, and this is how it is written. If you want to see the execution, so let's see the very first servlet application. There are few things we need to have in our system installed and get the setup ready. First, IDE for the coding, which helps to write the code and make the objects. Number 2, we need the server, application server or web server. It has to be configured, and Java, of course. So I have created my test web app Servlet app, as I mentioned, and there it is, my servlet. You can see here, this is my first servlet class file, and when we compile, it goes in the class file, and that exists in the build in the Eclipse IDE which I'm using. This is where my deployment descriptor exists. I'm defining all my servlet here, and next we have index.html. So, and I have already configured my web server here. So let's see how it goes. I'll show you the execution. So I just right click on my application and goes to the run on server. I have to configure my server here, and all I need to just select my application and see. My server started, and this is how my index.html content is. Hello world testing app, and this is what my index.html. But you can see the index.html is not mentioned here. It's only the test web app, and it is coming from the Web.xml. So this is very important to understand. The servlet is very efficient in respect to the security. Whenever we work in the servers, we have to make sure our address should not be out. So here the source files is not mentioned anywhere in this path. So this is why the servlet is very efficient and important. So here I'm gonna write down tech ranch and okay. So you can see welcome to Servlet Tech Ranch. Now if you see the path here, the test web app is your web application, which was mentioned in a Web.xml in a display name. Next we have servlet, which was a keyword which is mentioned again in the Web.xml. It starts from the index.html, goes to the hello servlet, goes to the first servlet, and from there again back to the parameter, and from there your index.html. From this path it's display from here, but still it is not mentioned anywhere what user entered here. You see, it's still mentioning just the servlet. So this is what the action, where you see here we have mentioned in an action. This action has to map your servlet with another next servlet name and link and communicate to the server. So this is all about the demonstration of servlet. First, hello servlet application. Important facts. So far we have learned all about the Servlet architecture, Servlet APIs, Servlet lifecycle method, and small demonstration. So let's see about important facts now. HTTP is a stateless protocol. That means once you create an instance of a request or response, you process it with the help of service method, and you destroyed it, the state is closed. Now you cannot come back or revert again back to the previous state. This is what the importance of to understand about the HTTP protocol. So whenever the servlet create a thread and of instance of a request and process the request and provide the response, and after providing the response to the client and destroying the instance, we cannot recreate that particular request. Servlet is a server-side Java program capable run in web server. So Servlet is very efficient sometimes when the requirement of an application is where you have to write the Java program within the server. post data form accessible to doPost and get type of data override by doGet. So we have to make sure when we use doPost and when we use doGet. There is a difference between the doPost and doGet that you will learn when we actually work and develop an application in few chapters. Here in Servlet API, we have Servlet exception, which helps to handle the exception and error while working with the web application. So this is all about the Servlet APIs and the lifecycle method. Next chapter we are going to learn in detail about Servlet implementation and web application development along with some homework. Thank you so much for watching TechCrunch, and please subscribe to the channel and get updates for more upcoming videos. Let's make coding fun. Thank you.